I was 26 the day Richard Lawson vanished from my life. It was early spring, the kind of morning when the sun rises like a pale coin behind a thin veil of mist. The roosters had crowed before dawn, the village children's chatter floated over the fences, and I was kneeling by the clay stove, stoking the fire for breakfast. Our daughter Lily, barely a year old, was still curled up on the bed under the patched quilt, her tiny mouth slightly open in sleep. The knock came sharply, 3 quick raps, then silence. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door, expecting it to be Aunt May dropping by for eggs. Instead it was the postman, his expression oddly guarded. "Letter for you, Clara," he said, handing over a single envelope, the paper creased and faintly smudged. My name was written in Richard's tidy, slanted handwriting. For a moment my chest warmed. He had been away for weeks at the factory in the city. Maybe he'd written to tell me when he was coming home. But when I tore the envelope open, a single sheet of paper slid into my palm, just one sentence, neat and cold. "Take care of my parents and our child. I'm leaving." No explanation. No return address. Just that. The stove smoke stung my eyes, but I knew it wasn't just the smoke. My hands trembled so hard the paper nearly tore. I ran down the dirt path to his parents' house. They were in the courtyard, his mother feeding the chickens, his father chopping wood. Both looked up when they saw me, and I knew instantly they already knew. "Where is he?" I demanded. His father's brows knitted. "Don't make a fuss, Clara. He's just under pressure. Give him time." "Time for what?" "He left without a word." I held up the letter like an accusation. His mother reached out to take it from me, but I jerked my hand back. She sighed and looked away, muttering, "You're overreacting. Men sometimes need space." I wanted to scream that men who needed space didn't disappear without telling their wives where they were going. But I bit my tongue because back then I still thought they were on my side. Richard never came back. For years I waited, clinging to the foolish hope that one day I'd hear his footsteps on the threshold. I raised Lily on my own, carrying her on my back to the fields in the summer, to the mountains in the winter to haul firewood. My hands grew rough from washing clothes in icy water, my back bent from endless work. And through it all I cared for his parents. Cooked for them, fetched medicine when they were sick, patched their clothes. They never once thanked me, but I told myself it didn't matter. Family was family. Time blurred the seasons together. Lily grew into a tall, bright-eyed young woman. Richard's parents aged and weakened. I nursed them until one by one they passed away, his mother first, then his father a year later, both in their 80s. I buried them with all the rites as if they were my own flesh and blood. When I turned 66, I thought perhaps I could rest at last. My body was tired, my hair entirely gray, but I felt a quiet satisfaction. I had kept my promise, the one Richard had left me with. I had taken care of his parents and our daughter. Then came the day I fell ill. It started as a dull ache in my chest, then a fever that refused to break. The doctor in town shook his head gravely, and before I knew it, I was lying in a hospital bed, Lily sitting beside me holding my hand. Her eyes brimmed with tears. "Mom, there's someone here to see you. An old friend." I frowned. I had no old friends left who would visit. But then the door opened, and in walked a man I had not seen in 40 years. Richard Lawson. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his hair only lightly touched with gray. Beside him stood a woman half his age, elegant, polished, and a boy of maybe 15, tall and handsome, the same sharp nose as Richard. He smiled faintly as if granting me a favor. "Clara. No matter what, we were husband and wife in name. You raised my daughter, you sent off my parents. So now it's only right that I come to see you off one last time." I could not speak. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might choke on my own rage. So he had been alive all along. Not only alive, thriving. With a new wife. A new family. The years of breaking my back, the winters when I'd gone to bed hungry so Lily could eat, the calluses, the loneliness, all while he had been living in comfort somewhere else. The woman beside him glanced at me with polite indifference, as if I were just some old acquaintance of her husband's. The boy looked mildly bored. And something inside me, something that had been patient, loyal, forgiving, snapped clean in two. When I opened my eyes again, the hospital bed was gone. The ceiling above me was lower, the light harsher. My heart raced. I knew this place. This was my bedroom in the small brick house my parents had left me, the house I'd lived in decades earlier. My hands were younger. My hair, though tied back, was still black with only a few strands of gray. And on the table beside me lay an envelope. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. I picked it up anyway. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the single sheet of paper. The same words. The same handwriting. Take care of my parents and our child. I'm leaving. It was the very first letter I'd received 6 months after Richard disappeared. I clutched it so hard my knuckles ached. The sound of a chicken clucking outside, the faint smell of wood smoke in the air. It was all real. I was back. Back before decades of bitterness and toil. In my past life I had read this letter and thought he'd died. That maybe he'd gone somewhere and met misfortune. I had cried myself sick, cursing fate, never suspecting he had simply chosen to start a new life without me. But now I knew the truth. This time there would be no patient waiting. No protecting his reputation. No raising his parents' heads high in the village while mine bowed. If Richard Lawson had decided to fake his death once, I would make sure that in this life he truly died, at least in the eyes of the village, the factory, and every connection he'd ever had. I sat on the edge of the bed, my pulse steadying. Outside, the morning sun was rising over the rooftops, turning the frost on the ground to glitter. Somewhere in the city, Richard was living his double life, not yet expecting the reckoning to come. I smiled to myself. A slow, deliberate smile. Let him enjoy the calm before the storm. The morning after Richard's farewell letter reappeared in my hands, I began my preparations. It was cold enough that frost still clung to the edges of the thatched roofs, but the air was bright and clear. My breath clouded in front of me as I walked through the village with a single purpose. This time I would not sit in silence, nursing heartbreak. This time I would drag his name into the open and bury it myself. First stop was the town's photo studio, a tiny shop that smelled faintly of developer fluid and stale tea. The owner, Mr. Latham, adjusted his round glasses and squinted at the worn photo I laid on the counter. Richard's old factory ID. I need this enlarged, I said. Framed with a black ribbon in the corner. His eyebrows shot up. A memorial? I met his gaze without blinking. Yes. He's passed away. I want it ready today. Mr. Latham hesitated. The village was small and rumors were currency. I'll have it done in an hour, he said finally, sliding the photo into an envelope. From there I walked down the lane to Uncle Ray's house. His place was impossible to miss. Faded red banners still fluttered from the last wedding he'd played at, and a cracked drum leaned against the doorframe. Uncle Ray was mending a trumpet when I arrived. Clara, what brings you here so early? I need your band, I said, my voice solemn. Richard Lawson has died. I want him sent off properly. Uncle Ray froze, the wrench in his hand hovering over the trumpet's valve. Richard? Gone. His face softened instantly. You poor thing. Say no more. We'll play so loud the ancestors will hear. Thank you, I murmured, lowering my eyes in mock grief while inside, a grim satisfaction bloomed. The louder the music, the faster the news would spread, and I wanted the whole county to hear it. By noon the band was in my courtyard. Drums boomed, gongs clashed, and the high, keening cry of the Swona horns spiraled into the air. Villagers began arriving in 2s and 3s, curiosity pulling them from their chores. I sat in the center of it all, wearing a plain black jacket, hair loose around my shoulders. In my arms I clutched Richard's enlarged memorial portrait, the ink still smelling faintly of chemicals. My eyes were red, my shoulders hunched. Beside me Lily sat on a low stool, her cheeks blotchy from crying. It's so sad, an elderly woman whispered to another. He was so young. Poor Clara, someone else added. Left with a child and no man to help. What will she do now? I kept my gaze down, but every word slid into my ears. Good. Let them talk. Let the story root itself deep in their minds. The commotion drew people from even the far edges of the village. Some came out of respect, others for the gossip. I knew the moment George and Martha Lawson returned from the fields because the air around me shifted, a ripple of tension moving through the crowd. George strode in first, his work shirt plastered to his back with sweat, boots still caked with mud. Martha trailed behind him with a basket of greens slung over one arm. Both of them froze when they saw the memorial portrait on the table before me. George's weathered face darkened immediately. What the hell is this? I lifted my tear-streaked face. Richard is gone. I need to send him off properly. It's just a pity we don't even know where his body is. But rights must be observed. Martha's basket slipped from her fingers, carrots rolling across the ground. Clara, put that picture away. Don't bring bad luck into this house. The black ribbon fluttered in the breeze, drawing eyes like a moth to flame. George took a step forward, his voice rising. Nonsense. How can you declare my son dead based on a single letter? Are you cursing him? I stood still, holding the portrait, and faced them squarely. If you believe he's alive, then tell me where he is. They glanced at each other, quick, guilty. George's mouth tightened. We don't know. The letter didn't say. We're just guessing. Guessing. My voice carried over the murmuring crowd. And yet you're so sure he's fine. George straightened, trying to reassert control. He's just caught up in something. Give him time. In my heart, I said, letting my voice break just slightly, I've already given him up. But I'll still go to the city to find him. Dead or alive, I need to know. That declaration stirred the neighbors instantly. That's right, called old Mr. Kendall from near the gate. If my son disappeared, I'd go myself. Better to know than to wonder, a woman chimed in. Otherwise you'll never sleep. George scowled, but Martha hurried forward and caught my arm. No, Claire, you can't. If you go to his workplace and make a scene, it will ruin his reputation. Even if he wants to come back, he won't be able to. It was word for word what they'd told me in my first life. Back then I'd believed it. This time I didn't even blink. What good is a job if he's dead? I said loudly, turning so the neighbors could hear. Isn't his life more important than his career? A wave of agreement rolled through the courtyard. Of course life's more important. She's right. You can always find another job. George's mouth opened, then shut. His eyes darted to the crowd. He knew they weren't on his side. Let's not be hasty, he said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Why don't we have Uncle Ray go first? He can ask around in the city. I narrowed my eyes. In my last life, that was the trap, sending someone else, then claiming they'd found nothing. But I kept my voice even. Fine, I said. Then I'll go with him. That caused a stir. George's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, old Mr. Kendall spoke up again. That's reasonable. What's wrong with her going along? Martha bit her lip, looking to George for rescue. The murmurs grew louder. Let her go. It's her right. What's the harm? Finally, George relented with a stiff nod. All right. Tonight we'll have Uncle Ray come over and we'll discuss it. That evening, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across my yard. I lit the oil lamp and set out tea, waiting for the promised meeting. The memorial portrait still stood in the main room, the black ribbons stark against the pale wall. But Uncle Ray never came. After supper, George strolled in casually, smelling faintly of tobacco. I spoke with Uncle Ray, he said. He'll go to the city tomorrow. You just stay here. My fingers tightened around my teacup, but I kept my expression calm. That's fine. I'll be ready to go with him in the morning. George's eyes flicked to the portrait again. Put that thing away, he snapped. I tilted my head. There's an old saying, keeping memorial items out can ward off bad luck. Maybe it'll bring Richard back to us. His scowl deepened, and without another word, he turned on his heel and left. I stayed up late that night, the oil lamp burning low, listening to the quiet creaks of the house. In my first life, I'd gone to bed believing their promises. This time I could feel the resistance in every step George took, in every glance Martha threw my way. They had no intention of letting me go to the city. But I was going, one way or another. And tomorrow I'd see just how far they'd go to stop me. The morning frost still glittered on the fence posts when it happened. I was slicing turnips for breakfast, the kitchen air thick with the scent of wood smoke, when a piercing scream ripped through the village. It was a shrill, desperate cry that made even the rooster on the fence fall silent. I didn't rush. I knew that voice. In my first life, I'd heard it on this exact morning. My mother-in-law, Martha Lawson, claiming she'd been injured by the ox in some tragic accident. That wound had kept her bedridden for weeks, conveniently preventing me from leaving the village to search for Richard. This time I had been ready. The night before, I'd slipped into their yard with a small bowl of chicken blood and poured it into the ox's feed. The metallic tang would make any animal restless and unpredictable by dawn. If Martha wanted an accident to happen, she'd get one. Only she wouldn't control the timing this time. I stepped into the cold morning air and walked toward the commotion. Half the village seemed to be there already. The ox was stomping and tossing its head in the pen, eyes rolling, breath puffing white in the chill. George Lawson, my father-in-law, stood near the gate, his face flushed and his hands gripping a shovel. On the ground, Martha lay clutching her shin, her face pale and lips trembling. Her basket of greens was overturned nearby, carrots and cabbage scattered across the frosted dirt. A thin trail of blood marked the fabric of her trousers. "She's hurt bad," George barked when he saw me. "We need to take her to the clinic right away." I crouched beside her, my voice calm but carrying enough urgency for the onlookers. "She might have more than a leg injury. She could have internal bruising, even bleeding." I looked directly at George. "We should take her to the city hospital." His expression flickered. "The clinic will do for now." "We can't." "No," I cut him off, raising my voice so the crowd could hear. "If we delay, it could cost her life. Are you willing to take that chance?" A ripple went through the neighbors. Old Mrs. Bright stepped forward, leaning on her cane. "She's right, George. At your wife's age, any injury could turn serious. The city hospital has the right equipment." "Exactly," a younger man agreed. "Don't be stingy. This is her life we're talking about." George's jaw worked, but I could see the resistance crumbling under the public pressure. Martha whimpered on cue, but her eyes darted nervously toward her husband. This wasn't the script they'd planned. "Fine," George muttered. "We'll go." I straightened. "I'll pack a few of her things." Inside my house I moved quickly. I filled a small cloth bag with toiletries, a fresh set of underclothes and a shawl. In the next room Lily was still sleeping, her little hands curled near her face. I smoothed her hair back and kissed her cheek. "Aunt May will take care of you until I get back," I whispered. When I returned, 2 young men from the village were already preparing a handcart to carry Martha. She groaned dramatically as they lifted her in, the sound of her discomfort drawing sympathetic clucks from the onlookers. The road to the main street was rough and frozen, every bump making the cart rattle. Martha let out sharp little cries at each jolt. I walked beside her, adjusting the blanket I'd draped over her legs. George trudged on the other side, his pipe clamped between his teeth, eyes narrowed against the wind. We reached the main road just as a grain merchant's cart was passing. The merchant, a thick-set man with a kindly face, agreed to let us ride in the back. The space was cramped, the sacks of millet scratching against our legs, but it was faster than walking the full distance. The journey to the city took hours. The sun rose high, the air warming slightly, but the wind still bit at our ears and noses. Martha leaned against the side of the cart with her eyes closed, her hand pressed to her leg. When we finally rolled to a stop in front of the city hospital, a squat brick building with chipped paint but a constant stream of people coming and going, I jumped down first, brushing millet dust from my skirt. 2 orderlies helped lift Martha from the cart and carry her inside. The reception area smelled of disinfectant, the walls lined with posters about hygiene and safety. A doctor in a white coat approached, stethoscope swinging from his neck. He examined Martha briefly, then frowned. "She may have a fracture, and her breathing suggests possible internal bruising. We'll need to run x-rays and keep her for observation." I nodded before George could speak. "Please admit her right away." Martha looked up at her husband as if expecting him to protest. He said nothing, but his lips pressed into a thin line. We followed the orderlies down a narrow hallway to a small ward with 2 other patients. The walls were bare except for a clock and a faded curtain that could be drawn around the bed. Martha was settled in with a pillow behind her head, the blanket tucked up to her chin. The nurse adjusted the drip stand and clipped a chart to the foot of the bed. "She'll need to stay for at least a few days," the nurse said briskly. "We'll monitor her closely." I pulled the shawl from my bag and draped it over Martha's shoulders. "You'll be fine here," I said in a warm, neutral tone. Her eyes flicked to George, then back to me. "You don't need to stay. Go back to the village and take care of Lily." I smiled faintly. "We'll see." George cleared his throat. "I'll stay here with her tonight. You can go home." I didn't answer. I simply pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, hands folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on the slow drip of the 4 bottle. Around us, the hospital moved at its usual rhythm. Footsteps in the hall, muffled conversations at the nurse's station, the occasional clatter of a dropped tray. Outside the window, the winter sun was beginning to tilt toward afternoon. I could feel George's eyes on me, measuring, calculating. In my first life, this was where they had managed to send me home, promising to keep me updated, while secretly working to block any attempt I made to search for Richard. But this time I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I was in the city now. That was enough. The next step would come soon. The hospital's ward clock ticked steadily, the seconds stretching out like taut wire. George sat on the chair near Martha's bed, tapping the stem of his pipe against his palm. Martha's eyes were half shut, but I could feel both of them glancing at me every so often, as though trying to puzzle out what I might do next. In my first life, this was the point where they had convinced me to return home for Lily's sake, while they claimed they would stay behind to care for Martha. Once I was gone, my search for Richard was over before it began. Not this time. When the nurse came to adjust Martha's fore, I stood. "I'll step out for a moment," I said, lifting the small cloth bag I'd brought with me. "I need to fetch some food. Neither of you has eaten all day." George grunted, too preoccupied with packing his pipe to question me. Once in the corridor, I walked with purpose, my shoes clicking against the scuffed linoleum. The hospital's main doors opened to a busy street, the winter air sharp on my face. I had no intention of buying food. My goal was Richard's workplace. The factory was a squat concrete building on the far side of the city, its yard crowded with stacked crates and the low rumble of machinery behind its walls. I spotted him almost instantly, not Richard but Mr. Harris, his old colleague. He was leaning against a stack of pallets, a cigarette between his fingers, his broad frame swathed in a heavy coat. "Harris," I called, my voice carrying just enough urgency to turn his head. He blinked, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, if it isn't Clara Hayes. Been a long time." "I'm sorry to trouble you," I said quickly, "but I need your help. It's about Richard." His smile faded. "He's not been around here much." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "But I have heard things." My fingers tightened on the strap of my bag. "What kind of things?" "Word is," Harris said slowly, "he's been seen with a woman from the city. Today's a special day for them." Something cold curled in my stomach. "Where?" He hesitated only a moment before answering. "The People's Restaurant. Big place. You can't miss it." I thanked him and on impulse asked, "Harris, do you remember how Richard got this job?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Your father's accident at the factory, the way the management offered the position to a family member, and you let Richard take it instead of yourself." "I remember." "Good. I would remember too." From the factory I went straight back to the hospital, not to linger but to gather my next set of allies. "Aunt May," I said when I found her visiting a cousin in another ward, "can you help me bring some of the neighbors here? I want them to see Martha. She'll be cheered up." Aunt May raised an eyebrow. She was quick enough to sense there was more to it, but nodded. "Leave it to me." By the next morning, a small convoy of neighbors had arrived in the city. They brought with them eggs, homemade brown sugar, and a boundless curiosity. After a brief visit to Martha's bedside, I suggested, "Since you all came so far, let's have a nice meal before heading back. I know a place." And so we walked together to the People's Restaurant. From the outside, it was the most impressive building on the street. Double doors with polished brass handles, red lanterns swaying above the entrance, the scent of braised pork and star anise drifting from within. I led the group inside. My eyes scanned the main hall quickly, honing in on a section to the side where a small stage had been decorated with fresh flowers. There, under the soft glow of paper lanterns, stood Richard Lawson, dressed in a groom's suit, holding the hand of a young woman in a red silk dress. My breath hitched, but not from surprise. I had expected this. The shock belonged to the neighbors. "City folks are so fancy," I murmured to Aunt May beside me, nodding toward the stage. "Look at the wedding clothes." Aunt May squinted, then stiffened. "Clara, that groom, he looks just like Richard." Others in the group turned their heads, whispers rising. "It can't be. No, it is him." I started walking toward the stage, my heart steady, my grip tightening on the strap of my bag. The closer I got, the clearer it was. The set of his jaw, the mole under his chin. There was no mistaking him. Aunt May called out, her voice carrying, "Richard." Richard's head jerked up. His eyes met mine for a split second before he turned away sharply, pretending not to hear. I did not slow my stride. When I reached him, I lifted my hand and slapped him across the face, the sound sharp in the quiet that had fallen over the hall. "Richard Lawson," I said, my voice cold, "you're marrying another woman without even informing your wife?" Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Richard's face flushed red, then drained pale. He stepped back, half shielding himself behind the young woman. Vanessa, I presumed, narrowed her eyes at me. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is my husband. We've never seen you before in our lives." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Never seen me? We share a child, Vanessa. Ask him who's been raising her while he's been playing groom in the city." The neighbors had caught up by now, their outrage boiling over. "You left a letter and vanished," one man shouted. "Your mother's in the hospital right now," another added. All around us, guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Richard and Vanessa. Some whispered. Others openly stared. Richard's mouth opened, but before he could speak, I heard a familiar voice call from the doorway. "Clara." I turned to see Mr. Harris standing there, his eyes sweeping over the scene before fixing on Richard. His expression hardened instantly. The room seemed to shrink around us. Richard cornered, me standing in front of him with half the village at my back, Vanessa clinging to his arm but looking less certain by the second. The air inside the people's restaurant felt heavier than smoke, thick with tension and the scent of uneaten food. Richard's eyes darted between me, the villagers, and Mr. Harris, as though calculating which direction offered the least damage. Vanessa still clung to his arm, her red silk sleeve bunching where her fingers dug into him. Harris stepped forward, his voice like a hammer on steel. "Richard Lawson, you have a wife back home. How dare you marry someone else here in the city?" The murmurs from the guests sharpened into open whispers. "So it's true. He's already married? What a shameless man." Richard stammered. We haven't registered the marriage yet. It doesn't count." Aunt May's voice cut through like a whip. "Doesn't count? You held a wedding ceremony in front of half the city. Everyone in the village knows you have a wife, Richard. Your mother is lying in the hospital right now," one of the men from the village called out. "And here you are parading around like a groom." Vanessa's cheeks flushed deep crimson, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. "You all need to leave. This is our private affair." I turned to face her fully, my tone cold. "Private? You've made it public the moment you stood here in a wedding dress with another woman's husband." Gasps and low chuckles rippled through the crowd. I let my bag slip from my shoulder, setting it down gently. Then I stepped closer to Richard, my voice dropping but still loud enough for everyone to hear. "You left me to raise our daughter alone. You left me to care for your parents until their last breath. I worked like a man in the fields and the mountains, hauling stones until my back was bent and my hands bled. And now you want to erase me." Richard's face tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. Harris's gaze stayed locked on Richard. "After everything Clara did for your family, you repay her like this? This is not just immoral, it's illegal." Richard swallowed hard. "Let's talk about this somewhere else." "No," I said, cutting him off. "We'll talk here in front of everyone. Since you didn't think to hide your betrayal, you can face its consequences in public." The villagers murmured their approval. Richard glanced around helplessly, then tried to smooth his tone. "Clara, I admit I was wrong. Let's just go back to the village. We can work things out." I straightened my shoulders. "There's nothing to work out. I want a divorce. And I have one condition: Lily stays with me." The room went still for a beat, the only sound the faint clink of a spoon in a distant kitchen. Aunt May tugged at my sleeve, whispering urgently, "Clara, think carefully. Raising a child alone isn't easy." I shook my head. "I've been raising her alone for years. I'm not about to hand her over now." Richard opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. "And another thing. After my father's accident, the factory offered that job to me. I let you take it because we were married. Now that we're not, the job should come back to me." Harris nodded once, firmly. "That's fair." Richard's face tightened. "You in factory sales? It's dangerous work for a woman. Just stay home and I'll send money every month." "Money from where?" I asked, tilting my head. "From the wages you've been hoarding for yourself? From the mistress who stands beside you." The guests erupted in muffled laughter. Vanessa's lips pinched into a thin line. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small worn notebook. The pages were filled with years of tidy writing. Every expense I've paid for your family is recorded here. Food, medicine, clothing, even the money for your parents' medical bills. For example, I flipped to a page near the back. Right now, I've borrowed 200 yuan from neighbors and friends for your mother's hospital deposit. Over the past 3 years, that's a total of 1,560 yuan. I looked at Harris. He should pay me back, shouldn't he? Harris's expression didn't waver. Yes. Richard's eyes darkened and Vanessa snapped, "How do we know those numbers are real?" I gave her a slow smile. Half of Richard's salary was rightfully mine. You don't get a say here. And I haven't even brought up the fact that you, a mistress, interfered in my marriage. Vanessa's face drained of color. I raised my voice again, turning to address both of them. If you don't pay what you owe, I'll make sure everyone in your workplace knows you tried to marry while still bound to another woman. Let's see how you hold your heads high then. Gasps and a few snickers ran through the crowd. Vanessa's parents hurried forward, whispering frantically to Richard. I caught snippets. Guests are waiting. Settle this quickly. Richard exhaled through his nose and gave a stiff nod. Fine. I'll agree. But he added, I don't have that much cash on me. I arched an eyebrow. You're holding a wedding and you're telling me you're broke? If I let you write an IOU, I'll never see a coin. Vanessa's jaw clenched. With a huff, she pulled a thick wad of bills from her embroidered clutch, counted out the exact amount and slammed it into my palm. I tucked the money into my bag. 1,560 yuan. Not a penny more or less. Turning to Aunt May and the villagers, I said, You've all seen and heard what happened today. Please explain it clearly to my in-laws later. Since Richard claims we never registered our marriage, it's as if all these years I spent raising our daughter mean nothing to him. The villagers nodded grimly. Aunt May rounded on Richard. Your mother is lying in the hospital and here you are throwing a wedding. What a fine son you are. I looked once more at Richard, not with the hope or longing I'd once felt, but with the cold satisfaction of a debt being collected. This part of the reckoning was done. There were still more accounts to settle, but that would come later. For now, I turned on my heel and walked toward the restaurant doors, the wad of bills warm in my hand and the eyes of the entire room following my back. The city streets were already glowing with evening lights by the time we left the People's Restaurant. The group from the village walked behind me, their voices low but brimming with excitement. Some replayed the moment I'd slapped Richard. Others muttered about Vanessa's pale face when she handed over the cash. Aunt May caught up to me, her breath clouding in the chill. Clara, you were steady as a mountain in there. Didn't flinch once. I gave a small smile, tucking the 1,560 yuan deeper into my bag. I've been waiting a long time to stop flinching. When we returned to the hospital, Martha was propped up against her pillows, sipping weak tea. She looked up sharply when she saw the villagers with me. Aunt May didn't waste a second. She planted herself at the foot of the bed, arms crossed. Martha Lawson, your son's in the city holding a wedding with another woman. Do you deny it? Martha's eyes flickered, but her lips pressed into a thin smile. You're mistaken. He's just confused. Needed time to think. Think. Aunt May snorted. More than a dozen of us saw it with our own eyes. He was in a groom's suit. Martha's hands trembled on the cup. No, that can't be. One of the younger men from the village leaned forward. We saw Vanessa too, Martha. The whole stage was decorated for them. Martha's lips parted and for a moment I thought she might deny it again. Instead she pressed a hand to her chest, muttering, "What a coincidence." Then realizing what she'd admitted, she clamped her mouth shut. The room went silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. I let the quiet stretch before speaking. Martha, Richard and I are divorced now. The job he took from me after my father's death? The factory has agreed to give it back to me. Her eyes widened. You can't take that job. George, standing by the window, turned abruptly. He's your husband. How could you be so heartless? I met his glare head-on. When you encouraged him to marry another woman, did you remember he was my husband? His mouth snapped shut, his face mottled with red patches. I straightened. There's more. After we married, your whole family moved into the house my parents left me. Now that the marriage is over, you'll have to move out. That house is mine again. The villagers behind me murmured in approval. Even Aunt May gave a satisfied nod. George's jaw worked as though he wanted to argue, but he must have seen the wall of neighbors at my back because he looked away instead. The next day I returned to the village with Aunt May and a small group of younger men. News of Richard's betrayal had spread like wildfire, not just through our village but into the neighboring ones. By the time we reached my yard, half the village knew exactly what we'd come to do. We moved quickly. Aunt May and 2 others went inside the house, gathering the Lawsons' belongings. Blankets, cooking pots, even George's battered pipe, all carried out and stacked in neat piles outside the gate. By dusk, the house was empty except for my own things and Lily's. That night, I cooked a pot of braised pork, the rich scent filling every corner of the now quiet house. Lily sat across from me, her cheeks pink from the steam, her laughter light and free. For the first time in years, I ate without the weight of unspoken resentment sitting on my chest. Halfway through the meal, an urgent pounding rattled the front door. When I opened it, George stood there in the lamplight, his hands gripping the handles of a wooden cart. On the cart lay Martha, her face pale and drawn. "You're heartless," George barked. "Your mother's sick and you turn us away? Don't you have any respect for your elders?" A cold laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "My parents are buried in the ground, George. Where did these new parents of mine come from? This house belongs to my mother and father. Your house is across the road, don't get confused." I started to shut the door but George shoved his shoulder against it. Aunt May's door creaked open across the yard. She stepped out, her nightclothes tucked hastily under a thick shawl. "What's this noise about?" She took one look at the scene and her eyes narrowed. "George Lawson, how shameless can you get? Dragging your wife over here in the middle of the night to steal from Clara." Her voice was like a bell, loud enough to reach every house within earshot. "Come see everyone. These 2 old foxes are trying to take from a widow and orphan." Within minutes, doors were opening, lanterns were lit, and voices were calling across the lanes. George's shoulders hunched as more neighbors emerged, some with arms folded, others shaking their heads. The humiliation burned in his cheeks. He grabbed the cart handles and turned away, muttering under his breath. Martha kept her gaze fixed on the ground, lips pressed tight. From her doorway, Aunt May called after them, "If you dare come back, don't blame me for not being polite." She came over to my yard, her expression still sharp. "I heard Richard's new wife doesn't have money for Martha's treatment. They checked her out of the hospital this morning. If they try this again, just shout for me." I thanked her quietly. As she walked away, I glanced across the road to where the Lawsons' house sat in darkness. For years, anything good in my house, meat, sugar, even warm winter clothes, had gone first to them. Lily and I had always been given the scraps. Now the balance had shifted. They were the ones shut out, their lives narrowing to a small, dim corner. And this was only the beginning. 2 days later, Mr. Harris arrived at my door with news. "The factory's management met yesterday. Richard's been officially fired. They're offering you his position, and they know you'll be raising your daughter alone. They'll even set you up in a single dormitory in the city." I felt a thrill of quiet triumph. "Thank you, Harris. Truly." He waved it off. "You earned it. Be ready to start next week." That night, I sat at the table with Lily asleep in the next room, the lamplight flickering against the window pane. The sound of the wind outside was no longer lonely. It was the sound of change coming. In my first life, I had stayed in the village, letting the Lawsons dictate my every move. This time I would step into the city on my own terms. I would take the job. I would build something from it. And I would never again wait for a man to decide my fate. The following Monday dawned crisp and bright, the kind of winter morning where the frost on the ground sparkled like powdered glass. I loaded Lily's few belongings into a burlap sack, strapped them to the back of Uncle Harris's old bicycle, and climbed onto the narrow rear rack. Lily sat snug in my lap, bundled in the thickest coat we owned. As the bicycle rattled over the uneven road, the village houses shrank behind us. The wind stung my cheeks, but my heart was warm. For the first time in years, I was leaving not as someone abandoned, but as someone taking her own step forward. The city greeted us with the noise of trolley bells and the smell of coal smoke. The factory's front gates loomed ahead, tall black iron with a small brass plate bearing the company name. The manager met us in the courtyard, his handshake firm. "Mrs. Hayes, welcome. We've prepared the dormitory for you." It was a modest single room on the second floor of the workers' building. One iron bed, a wooden table, a small stove in the corner. Bare but clean. Enough for Lily and me to start anew. The next morning I stepped into the sales department for the first time. In my first life I'd never dared to take such a position. But now I remembered exactly what had happened when Richard worked here. The skills he'd learned, the contacts he'd made, and how he'd turned them into opportunity when the factory restructured years later. If he could do it, so could I, better even. The work was hard. I spent my days on the road, visiting clients, memorizing product details until I could recite them in my sleep. My shoes wore thin from walking, my voice grew hoarse from pitching to skeptical shop owners, but each small sale was a step toward independence. By the 6th month I had climbed to the top of the sales rankings. The factory bulletin board bore my name at the very top, and other departments began to nod to me with respect when I passed. In my first life, the state-owned factories began restructuring not long after. This time I saw the signs early, the budget cuts, the whispers in the break room, the smaller orders trickling in. I didn't wait for the axe to fall. When the voluntary layoff notice went up, I was the first to sign. The severance pay combined with the money I'd saved gave me a starting sum. I rented a tiny storefront in a busy part of the city and began selling home appliances, kettles, rice cookers, small radios. At first it was just me behind the counter, greeting customers, hauling boxes, wiping shelves until they gleamed. Lily, now old enough for school, would do her homework at the back table. Business was slow in the beginning, but I knew my trade. I remembered which models had sold well during Richard's years, which suppliers were reliable, which credit terms could be negotiated. Month by month the profits grew. I expanded into a second shop, then a third. Eventually I was too busy to manage them all myself and began hiring staff. It was on an ordinary Tuesday while I was reviewing inventory sheets that I heard the bell above the door jingle. When I looked up I almost didn't recognize him. Richard Lawson. He had aged, the lines on his forehead deeper, the skin under his eyes sagging. His suit was cheap and slightly frayed at the cuffs. He stood there with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you've opened quite a few stores," he said lightly. "We're old acquaintances, right? Since you're hiring, why not make me a store manager or something?" I leaned back in my chair studying him. "If you're hungry I can treat you to a meal. But I've never heard of a beggar demanding to be king." His face darkened. "Don't forget, Clara, you wouldn't have today without your ex-husband's help. You ought to be grateful." I smiled thinly. "Help? You mean abandoning me with a child and your parents while you remarried?" "Yes, Richard, you were a great help." His jaw clenched and he jabbed a finger toward me. "You just wait and see." He left in a huff, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time. 2 days later it wasn't Richard who appeared, it was his parents. They shuffled into my shop with exaggerated weariness, their hair white, their clothes worn. "Clara," Martha rasped, "we're your parents. How can you get rich and forget about us?" I raised an eyebrow. "Parents? My parents are buried in the ground. And last I checked, you have your own house across the road." "Even if you don't care about Richard," George said quickly, "think about Lily. He's her only father. You have so many stores now. What's one more? Just let Richard manage one." My gaze slid past them to the shop door, where a familiar figure was lingering, Vanessa, her belly noticeably rounded. An idea sparked. "Your daughter-in-law is standing right there. Should I call her in to hear your suggestion?" George and Martha stiffened, but it was too late. Vanessa had already stepped inside. "What are you two talking to her about?" Vanessa demanded. "They were here begging me to give Richard a store," I said plainly. Vanessa's face twisted. "Begging her? For him?" She snatched up a broom leaning against the counter and swung it at George. He dodged, but Martha, slower and coughing, caught a glancing blow on the shoulder. The scene dissolved into chaos, with Vanessa shouting accusations and the old couple retreating out the door. The next day Vanessa returned, alone this time. She dragged a chair to the entrance and sat down, her belly like a shield. Whenever a customer approached she would declare loudly, "The store's closed." My staff looked to me in alarm. "Even if we call the police, she's pregnant," one whispered. "They can't do much." I told them not to worry. I had a plan. By the following morning I'd assembled my own barricade, a row of 7 or 8 elderly women from the village, led by Aunt May herself. I paid each of them 50 yuan a day, and they sat in front of the store munching sunflower seeds, shifting to block Vanessa whenever she tried to move. Vanessa grew more and more frustrated, until finally she tried to dart inside. The old women parted at the last moment and she stumbled, falling onto the pavement. She wailed for the police, claiming she'd been attacked. But when the officers arrived, every single one of my blockade swore they hadn't touched her. Vanessa left that day with a broken tailbone, sent back to the Lawsons' house to be cared for. And that, I thought, was a fitting introduction to Richard's new life. Winter in the city that year was bone-deep cold. The kind of cold that made the air feel brittle, as if a sudden noise might shatter it. I was in my office above the flagship store, reviewing quarterly sales figures, when Aunt May burst in without knocking. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, her scarf trailing snowflakes onto the floor. "Clara," she panted, "did you hear? The Lawsons' house burned down last night." I set down my pen slowly. "How?" "No one's sure. Some say it was the stove. Others say Richard left something cooking and fell asleep." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "They're staying in the warehouse behind the old grain store now. I passed it this morning. No heat, leaky roof. Looks like a family of beggars." In my first life I would have felt pity. Now I only felt the strange weightless calm of balance being restored. Richard's pride had already been stripped away piece by piece. First his job, then his marriage, then his reputation. Now even the house that had once been filled with my labor was gone. A week later he came to see me. I was rearranging new rice cookers on the front display when the bell jingled and in he walked, shoulders hunched, a threadbare coat hanging from him like damp laundry. "I need a loan," he said without greeting. I looked him up and down. "From me." "You have money," he said simply. "I'll pay it back." I smiled, leaning on the counter. "Like you paid back the years I spent carrying your family on my back? Or the hospital bills I covered? Or the 1,560 yuan you needed Aunt May to witness before you handed it over?" His mouth tightened. "Clara, you've won. Enough's enough." I straightened. "I'm not playing a game, Richard. I built what I have with my own hands while you wasted every chance you had. That's the difference between us." For a moment I thought he might lash out. But he only swallowed hard, muttered something under his breath and walked out into the snow. By spring my fourth store was ready to open. The day before the ribbon cutting I saw Vanessa for the first time in months. She was pushing a pram with a baby bundled inside, her hair greasy, her coat too thin for the wind. When our eyes met across the street she stopped as if deciding whether to approach. In the end she turned away without a word, her shoulders hunched like Richard's. The opening day was busy, customers coming and going in a steady stream. Harris stopped by with flowers, grinning from ear to ear. "You've done it, Clara. You're the biggest home appliance seller in the district now." I smiled genuinely at that. I couldn't have done it without good people like you at my back. "Good people help those who deserve it," he said simply. Months later, news trickled in that Richard had left the city entirely. Some said he'd gone south to work as a porter in a shipping yard. Others claimed he was living with distant relatives, doing odd jobs for meals. I never sought confirmation. His fate was no longer my concern. One warm evening as I sat in the shop's back office counting receipts, Lily came in with 2 ice creams, one vanilla, one red bean. She handed me the vanilla without a word and climbed into the chair opposite me. "Mom," she said softly, "are we going to be okay forever now?" I set the receipts aside and took her small hand in mine. "We've been okay for a while now, Lily. You just didn't notice because I was busy making sure of it." The sun dipped low outside, casting the shop in golden light. I thought of the girl I'd been in my first life, bent-backed, silent, afraid to speak for fear of being told I was ungrateful. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built her own ground to stand on. One evening just before closing I stepped outside and locked the shop doors. The street was quiet except for the hum of a distant trolley. I turned my face up to the sky, the spring air soft and warm against my skin. Richard had taken years from me. But I had taken them back, reshaped them and turned them into something stronger. And now there was nothing left for him to take. Final reflection. In my first life I thought survival meant enduring whatever came. In this one I learned that survival can mean building walls high enough that no one can reach you, unless you choose to let them in. Richard, Vanessa, the Lawsons, they were chapters. I was the book. And my story was far from over. The end.